So here's the thing about Semi-Pro. We're back with another episode. I've brought with me the esports historian that you all know and love, or love to hate, as it were. It's Thorin, and he's joining me to talk a little bit about the coaching scandal and some of the fallout that we've seen in the CSGO scene. Obviously, you're a student of history, we can say, and you've studied CSGO, I would say, or just Counter-Strike in general, more than pretty much anybody else that's still active in the scene. As far as CSGO goes, the first question is going to be about just like the context of what this actually means for the scene, because what I saw initially was a lot of people got wrapped up in the whole understanding of how big it was in the moment, but it does recontextualize, in my mind, a lot of events that we've seen or a lot of results that we've seen that have been online. There's always been those asterisks around online play. It's not as serious. Players aren't in the zone to the same degree. But now when we've got 37 coaches found guilty just with the initial report and ESIC coming out with another report at the end of this month, I'm basically asking for a little bit of context historically. Is this the worst breach of ethics when it comes to the professional scene that you've seen in Counter-Strike history?
I think in terms of like an actual above ground public one where all the investigations being done by credible people and the results have essentially like implicated all these top people from the professional scene, I think you'd have to say so, because the only things that are really comparable are either, I would say, cases like match fixing, which obviously is very sparse in terms of people ever actually being caught and properly punished. That's like basically there's one or two cases of that ever, even though you might have very strong suspicions people did it. And then the other thing, which I mean, this technically is tied into, I notice a lot of people seem to get a bit lost as to what category this is in. This is just cheating. It's like essentially the coach essentially having like a wall hack and just seeing what's going on. So that's one of the things I found a little bit surprising actually about some of the public reaction is if there was one player who'd used a wall hack in these circumstances, people would lose their minds in a way that they didn't, some of them, compared to a coach essentially having like a similar kind of unfair advantage that the opponent couldn't know about. It's like the double whammy in that sense. Like it's bad enough that the guy is doing something you can't do. If he's also, you don't know he's doing it, that's going to make it even more illegitimate as a result. So I actually think this probably is the biggest scandal ever, especially because it had that very weird element to it where technically we can like retroactively find out people did this like back into like, I heard the earliest one, someone claimed like 2015.
Yes, that's what I heard as well.
So if that's really the case, there's the other thing. Normally, if you catch people off as a scandal, it's like within that sort of a time frame, like the last 3 months of that. So yeah, that's to me, it's the far-reaching implication because they do go back into history. And as you allude to, there was always a sketchy reputation for online play. And obviously, it has always been stigmatized to be an online or an only good online. But it wasn't necessarily for these reasons. But this certainly doesn't help, does it? Like people obviously already wondered what the other competitors could be up to when they're not in front of a tournament admin, referee, people who can kind of check that you're playing by the rules.
Well, one of the things you alluded to, obviously, is match fixing itself being another allegory to this. And the first thing that comes to mind that's as far-reaching in terms of how damaging it could be to the scene was the Brood War match fixing, which is obviously many, many years ago. But thinking across multiple games made me think this might actually be the worst the worst scandal, we could say, the worst breach of ethics across all of esports. Do you think it ranks up there with that? Is it more than just a Counter-Strike thing now because of the scale and because of the far-reaching implications?
Well, the funny thing is, like, in terms of the actual, like, punishments handed out, those match fixing cases, particularly the Korean ones, were actually the most harshly dealt with because effectively, the second you got caught for that, not only was your career over, but in most of those cases, a lot of people don't know this, both in the Brood War case and the Starcraft 2 case, those people, I believe, were also actually criminally prosecuted in South Korea by, like, officials of the police, etc. Whereas if you look at cases like the iBuyPower match fixing, or these coaches getting banned now, technically, by the way, the coaches getting banned now have yet to actually receive any punishment from Valve. This is all actually third party people who run the tournament, essentially, and the circuit who are punishing them. Valve has yet to say if they're going to ban them, whatever it's going to happen anyway. So I would say in terms of like overall harshness, it's that. But if you want to look at like just how widespread the problem was, I don't think anything can really compare to this coaching issue. Bearing in mind, I think the stat was like 37 coaches or something. Yeah. And of those coaches, it's not even just one or two. There's like half a dozen we're talking like maybe 10, 12 that are like known people that have been relevant, that some of their teams have won majors, done amazing things in Counter-Strike, been among the top ranked teams in the world. So yeah, the difference with some of the other match fixing cases is it tended tended to be like one big name and then maybe a couple of smaller names. And it was like a little pocket of the scene was rotten. This makes it seem like within the whole scene, we didn't know there were these rotten elements and they were just rotting away behind the surface. And we thought this was just a perfectly reasonable ecosystem.
Well, like you're talking about now, one of the biggest and most puzzling like reactions from the general public was I saw that a lot of people were going to bat for the people who had been accused and the people who had been, had come out in this ESIC investigation, that they were named among the coaches. Obviously Robin and Gary of FaZe and Furia respectively had some sort of response in a way where they did accept the results, but they also disputed the factual, like the whether or not the claims could be verified. So in a situation like that, especially considering the CS scene right now is very like fast moving and everything's like, packed together very tightly. The tournament scenes are really compact and you're just going from one tournament to the next and everything's moving really fast and nothing's really been paused, even regardless of this scandal in the news. I have seen a lot of sympathy and a lot of people who are essentially arguing for the overturning of some of these bans. And one of the things that you covered on one of the recent By the Numbers was that you just couldn't understand why that was the case. And I'm pretty much in the same boat. Do you have some sort of just idea of why the general fans are behaving the way that they are and they're going to bat for these guys, even though, like you're saying, it's a very deep-seated issue that affected a huge number of teams, but it doesn't seem like the visceral impact of it has been felt in the same way, commensurate to the actual number of offenses and the scale at which it has gone on.
Unfortunately, this is basically like a tale as old as the internet, which essentially goes like this. But why are my enemies holding me to a double standard they don't hold themselves to? Which is just what everyone on the internet's been saying for like the last 20 years. Because unfortunately, what the internet's revealed to us is how ridiculous human nature is, which is that if you like the person, you will automatically grasp for reasons or straws that like maybe they didn't do it for that realm. Maybe there's an excuse or, maybe they come from a bad circumstance. Like, I've had all sorts of weird angles like set up to tell the story of how at the end, a guy essentially used like a built-in fucking wall hack in Counter-Strike. And that somehow doesn't mean he should be punished heavily. Like, it's such a bizarre scenario. So I'll have to say, if people want to put this in the historical context, probably the most famous incident of people hating on players for something unethical they did was perceived to be the famous all-off boost at DreamHack Winter 2014, because it was a major and because it was the two best teams in the world, and especially because the team that used it and then won the match, even though they later forfeited, Fnatic, was also losing in the match. So the perception from fans was like, right, so you were losing, you were going to finally be beaten by like the number 2 team who you'd beat a bunch of times. And then right when you were sort of supposed to lose finally, you unfairly pulled out this sort of like, it wasn't considered cheating, but it was like unethical, people thought. Because what people thought was, if you knew about that boost, it was a real game-breaking boost, which, by the way, in chronologically and contextually, they didn't quite know those things in the same ways that fans think they did. But their perception was you should have reported it to Valve in case it was a game-breaking thing so they could fix the game. Well, I'll tell you what, first of all, how bad does that make pretty much the entire CSGO scene who are aware of this bug, that they waited half a decade to let anyone know it existed? And then secondly, this is what I was getting to. What a lot of people won't know actually about that situation with Fnatic is that didn't exist in a vacuum. It was connected, unfortunately, to a year prior at DreamHack Bucharest. There was a very famous incident where some of the Fnatic players, JW, Crumbs wasn't in the team at the time, JW, flusha, etc., were in the team, and they had an incident against NIP, who at the time were like the number 1 team and the big fan favorites, and everyone loved them. Obviously, Swedish rivalry, where there was an incident where like they wouldn't shake hands when Fnatic beat them, or people claim that, like, I forget if they say it was Moddy, like, slightly elbowed someone when he walked past him, something like that. Basically, it was, like, very simple bravado. Put it this way, you see worse stuff in an NBA game when people are like, hold me back or whatever. But that set the scene, though, that people in this community didn't like Fnatic. They thought Fnatic was sort of the heels, were the villains anyway. So basically, what I'm getting to is, I actually do genuinely think the real reason why people were massive cunts to Fnatic, etc., is just because they didn't like them. And it was just, they used the boost as a stick to beat them with. Whereas the problem is, there's too many coaches have been caught. And because there's too many, we've suddenly gone into the uncomfortable area where it's people we actually like. Like, like I was like, I'm friendly with Raging from Mouse Sports. I've known Peter many, many years. There's the whole bunch. Starix is a legend of the CIS scene. Like, it's uncomfortable when it's the people you actually respect and like who did the cheating. But that's also why I would say a key point I hope people have taken from this whole incident is whenever you hear me and Richard on talk shows discuss very like nuanced topics like this, if you notice, what we always try to do is explain our principles before we sort of come to the conclusion. Because as a journalist, you need to basically have like consistency in that regard anyway. Otherwise, you have no credibility. You're just a joke.
Yeah.
So what you essentially need to do is what people don't do, unfortunately, is you've got to spend time ahead of what could happen, figuring out where you stand on it. Like, what would I do if someone did this? Or what would I think if someone said this other thing? Or what would I do if in this scenario a crime occurred and it was someone I liked who was involved versus some. If you don't figure that stuff out, because you're just going to be like basically figuring it out on the fly as it happens, you're going to end up being a corrupt person. Because what will happen is when something initially happens for the first time and you don't like the person, you'll come down super hard. And then you know what? Next week, it'll be your mate that says a word you're not allowed to say, that does something that's unethical. And all of a sudden, people will be allowed to say, based on what you set, the standard you held the other person to, you have to hold him to that standard. You won't at that point in time. So this is one of the reasons maybe this gets lost. People, believe it or not, try to make it sound like I'm like a bleeding heart when it comes to people who've been banned. Because I always say, kind of like Richard, generally I don't believe in like lifetime bans. I believe there should always be like rehabilitation options. You should be allowed to fuck up more than once, essentially, you know, not least because it's the way the world works, you know, like if one steroid ban banned you in like UFC, there'd be like 80% of the people gone off the roster, mate. Like, you wouldn't even be able to have a sport. So I think just logistically it's worth it. But more importantly, the real reason I argue for that is exactly because of cases like this. Because I'm not just thinking like, oh, well, KQLY got banned. Well, what the fuck do I care about KQLY? He's an arsehole. Yeah, great, ban him. But the point is, what if that ended up being some really amazing player I like that got banned there? I have to be consistent. So that's why I feel like a lot of the community fell down, is they're still reacting from the initial flow chart of like, do I like the person or not? It's like, you got to know what the punishment is no matter what. Because I genuinely think if this was only coaches that we all disliked, so like in the current climate, Starix, etc., or it was just like one coach, say one coach had been cheating for 5 years, dude, I think most fans and even other pros would say, throw the book at this guy, ban him for life. But when it's all their mates, all of a sudden everyone suddenly wants clemency and let's have like a reasonable process and appeals. Like, it's funny how things work, isn't it?
Of course. Well, one of the things in sort of deference to what you're talking about when it comes to consistency and the consistency of somebody's moral standings or their principles is you have a video dating back to 2016, a Thorin Thoughts video called The Cheating Problem. And of course, it's not exactly related to coaches. It's more in line with the cheating accusations that were happening, especially after KQLY got banned and, you know, Flusha was getting accused left and right. And one of the things that you had said in that particular video was that if there was a case, an imaginary hypothetical, where they found evidence for 50 pros cheating at the top level of Counter-Strike, your proposed solution would be to simply ban them all and enter into a period of rebuilding. And I want to contrast that with what we've seen in the current scene with regards to the coaching stuff, because the coaches are, in many respects, like by and large, they're still with their organizations or they're being picked up by other organizations. They're not considered, you know, obviously banned by Valve or banned even by ESIC from ever holding the position again, or even from like banned from being involved in the pro scene in any capacity. You know, it's just in the coaching capacity. So they're still being hired on as analysts and maybe their pay gets docked. But, you know, there's not really enough transparency to know the exact details of all the different cases. But bearing in mind that there's, you know, this example of your thought process back in 2016, I was curious as to whether or not that had changed at all. Or, you know, do you feel the same way about these coaches? Do you think that they should be held to like the same kind of standard? Do you think that we should just blanket ban them, at least for the time being? Should they be let go of their organizations, or should they still be allowed to participate in some smaller, reduced amount?
If it was up to me, if I was the one who ran the organization in which a coach had cheated in some capacity, at a minimum, I would personally mirror the bans of the ESIC people. As in, if you work for me, right, you're fired and you can't potentially join again as a coach or in any capacity for whatever it might be, 4 months, 6 months, 2 years. I can't remember what each person's ban would be. Obviously, would be proportionate. So if I was going to do it, and the reason why I would do that It's because otherwise my organization apparently doesn't think that that was a punishment worthy crime. I'm going to say, oh, because someone else has punished you, the tournament that you cheated in, I'm not going to punish you. Well, what is that like? In most companies, if we're going to go along the premise, listen, it can sometimes just be a naive pipe dream that the company wants a set corporate culture and certain like philosophy to be espoused among the halls of the company, etc. Then in theory, you should want to punish the person as well on the basis that like, I mean, you've brought the name of the team into disrepute. You've potentially now made your players be considered borderline cheaters that can now be called out by the other peers in the scene, etc. Like that should come with a punishment. The problem is this, and essentially what we're also getting to the bottom of here is a problem that everyone saw with the whole Blast Neon thing and LEC Neon, which is that none of these companies actually are accountable. And even worse, while they're in the one hand telling you how important values and principles are to them, they never had any to begin with. And so the problem is this. Realistically, what I'm asking for is someone to do that, is to say, right, well, as a man, I don't tolerate that within my company, and I'll live my life by these certain principles. So unless you do, you don't match up with my vision right now, so you have to be removed. Instead, a lot of these teams, though, will just think this. Right, well, we're already going to lose because this guy can't be our coach for X period of time just because he literally can't in the tournaments. So why should we lose all the value he can bring to our org? Maybe he could still be a good GM or analyst or something. And it's true. If you want to talk about pure like utilitarian angle, he can bring them all to their org. But my problem with that is, yeah, in that scenario, you're not punishing him. You're essentially saying, I somewhat condone what he did. Because the real issue is, collectively, you would need the whole scene to pull together to properly punish these guys. Because what really needs to happen is, realistically, if I think short term as one of those org owners, yeah, it's true. If I fire the guy, and let's think of some of the good examples, like Hunden's probably the worst example, in as much as like he is the most valuable to his team. Like he's got a team of like unknowns or never were's, and he helped make them the number one team in the world, or at least he did some of the heavy lifting as a coach, and then they got there. So in that scenario, if you're a org, not only do you not want to get rid of Hunden because you'll lose what he brings, but you're just giving him, in your perception, to one of your rivals. It's like, what? So I should get punished 3 times. I should lose him. I have to get rid of him as well. And I just give him to my rival and he becomes good. So really the problem is, if the scene actually wanted to send a message, this is unacceptable, all the top orgs would essentially have to get together as a cartel and just say, right, we're all going to agree. We're not only going to fire these coaches for the period of their ban, but we're going to mirror them. Like, I'm not going to hire your coach. If Hunden's available, even if I need him, I'm not going to hire him till your period's expired. And then after that, listen, I've mentioned it before, I'm in favor of rehabilitation. Like, if after the period of their ban, they want to come back and start over from square one and build their reputation up, I'm sure they can be a good coach. I have no issue with that. But you can see we're never really going to, unfortunately, root this out of the scene unless you have like I would say like everyone has to be on board, because there'll always be somewhere you can go otherwise. It's one of the reasons why, if you haven't noticed, that whole like topic, which this tangentially goes into sort of like cancel culture or whatever, what people never bring up is this. The people who really get cancelled are people whose career was tied to like 1 or 2 entities, where if you convince the entity, they're banned. If you're someone who's in like a freelance environment, it's very hard to actually fire that person, because even if he gets fired from here, there's someone else who'll take him on, someone else will hire him, someone else will put him on their platform. So, like, unfortunately, we're never going to probably get like true justice on this coaching thing. They probably all will just shuffle to other roles. I wouldn't even be surprised, by the way. I'll just say this as like speculation, but I know it's going to happen. There'll be some teams, by the way, who even publicly fire the coach and then secretly behind the scenes still use him for, you know, information, basic things that you don't have to be on camera for. There'll be some teams who'll do that.
Well, you did mention that since we don't have a way to essentially get all of the teams into a cartel like you're talking about and have everybody mirror the same bans in the ecosystem, you know, my gut reaction would be to suggest that Valve should actually step in and do something. But even in that context, we've seen, based on the iBuyPower bans, that not only did Valve really only have the authority to ban them from Valve-sanctioned events like majors and major qualifiers, but also eventually other tournament organizers decided to go against that ban and, you know, allow the iBuyPower players to be brought onto teams and play in those events. Eventually, those particular cases were allowed in that sense. So some tournament organizers still wanted to play nice with Valve's rules, or they thought that maybe if they went against them, that wouldn't happen. Do you think that Valve coming in and actually enforcing the ban, mirroring the ban, but across the entire game, would it really be a good thing? Because in a way, it's like them overstepping the boundaries that they've historically done. Do you think that it's warranted in this case? Would that be something that would actually be a net benefit to the scene if Valve decided all of the coaches that have been named in the ESIC investigations are banned from all majors or all Valve sanctioned events for the remainder of their ban periods?
I mean, I do personally think that Valve. I mean, I try not to generally use the word should, because like even thinking of a premise in which there's a world where we could just mandate to each other how like reality should be, like that's difficult. But if we just use it in the sense of like what I would like to do, what would like to see happen, yeah, I would like Valve in theory in an ideal world to do something, because they're the ones who have the power to actually ensure that this does happen, that it is a blanket ban, and that people, as you alluded to, well, even though Valve didn't actually tell people like ESL, you can't let these players play in your tournaments, as you alluded to, it was years before those tournaments broke ranks with Valve. They essentially just mirrored what Valve did, not least because back then, most of those TOs thought if you don't do it, it just is less likely when you all go and bid for the major that they pick you out of the panel of 3 or 4 people, and then the other 3 did mirror it. So there was kind of like a cynical element to it before, where I don't even think that some of those people did think the ban should last that long. They just thought, wow, whatever, Big Daddy's spoken, what's the point in getting on the bad side of them, basically? Because the problem is this, though. In practice, I don't know if I want Valve to do anything, because Valve historically tends to be like you go in and you complain like, oh, I've got a hangnail. And they're like, nah, I don't care. You go, no, now my finger's hurting. And they go, I don't really care. And then you go, no, my hand's hurting. And they go, right, I've chopped your whole fucking arm off. There you go. Is that good? And you're like, well, technically my finger isn't hurting anymore. Like, well, then shut up. I'll chop the other one off as well. And you're like, fuck it, all right. Like, so the big problem is they haven't historically shown, like, in my opinion, a responsible attitude. Like, they tend to just wait until it's like, that's why the other analogy I tend to give is like an absent parent. And the idea is, it's like they just hear too much noise coming in the room and just come in and whip everyone's ass. Like, that's not an ideal parenting, is it? Yeah, it is technically taking care of the problem, but if anything, you're just making people have to fear you. That's the only way that they'll do anything. So my problem is, I just wish, this is another area. I know this is something of a horse that's been beaten to death by people talking about it. But the obvious thing would be to have some kind of interface between Valve and the community. So it could be from their end. It could be someone who starts as a Valve employee and learns the space and learns the community, comes to all the majors, talks to people about these issues, maybe even as like a front-facing guy who could come on talk shows and discuss it. That would be cool. Or you can go the other way. The obvious way to me is you take someone from the community who's like a reputable person, has shown they care about these issues, and you transition them towards that. And the idea is they'd get to know Valve software, and then Valve could just go to them as their go-to guy who could tell them what's going on. Because I feel like unless you know a lot of the nuanced elements of the scene, and especially what we're trying to do with it almost as a sport, as a competitive discipline, whereas Valve, maybe they think of it just as their game that has a sporting side attached to it. So I feel like you've got to have someone who has a similar mindset to how we do in esports if you're going to come to similar conclusions. Because I don't know what metrics Valve uses to make their decisions when they do those punishments. And if you notice, in my opinion, the part that they do, this is my speculation on their theory, based on how them and other game devs have talked in the past. One thing I don't like is they still seem to apply this logic that basically goes, even if you're like the number one most famous pro player, so League of Legends, you could be Faker. In CSGO, you could be Simple or whoever it's going to be. They want to behave as if I'm going to treat your case like you were any random player who just started the game. And the problem with that is, like, that's just not the way any industry in the world works. Like, you don't treat a top NFL star the way you would a kid who was being mean in Pee Wee football. Like, you just don't. Like, it's not. So, unfortunately, as long as they keep doing that approach, it's going to seem like they're kind of a bit capricious, in my opinion.
Well, one way that particularly Valve, could potentially make real change in a way that I think might be a little bit less controversial or risky in terms of overstepping their boundaries would be obviously figuring out some way to explain why the coaching bug existed for 5 years in the game code for so long. And this is another case similar to what I was talking about when we were talking about the public reaction to the coaching bans and people coming to bat for them. I've seen a lot of inexplicable sympathy for Valve and Valve's coders and Valve's code base, people saying, perhaps Valve shouldn't be held accountable because maybe the programmers who wrote that code that created that bug aren't there anymore, or, going back to the root of it, or just that, Valve didn't even really want coaching. So of course they did. They were forced in some mad way to half-ass their implementation of it or something like that. I've seen some pretty wild takes when it comes to that. What's your take on specifically Valve's responsibility when it comes to the game side? Because that's the one thing that we're really supposed to be able to trust Valve to do somewhat correctly. And regardless of your opinions on the meta or like the specifics of how the pro scene is shaped up, at the very least, we should be able to expect them to, have functioning code that doesn't allow for some of these sorts of exploits. So what do you think in terms of Valve's responsibility on a more like programming side of things?
In the short term, like if this is a bug that had only existed, let's say 2 months, and Valve's just found it now in the second month, and yeah, it's ruined a few matches, but they fix it. I have sympathy in that regard. Like, yeah, there's a bazillion possible bugs in the game, things that can happen. Obviously, in this particular case, it only affected pro play, essentially. Like, no one's doing this in matchmaking, no one's having coaching slots, etc. So in terms of their entire business of running Counter-Strike, I have some sympathy, but only to a point. Like I say, it depends on the time frame. Because the issue to me is, what is the process by which Valve is informed of these kinds of bugs by pro players? Because as far as I can tell, that process is broken or doesn't exist. And the reason why that is actually quite frustrating to me is because, again, a fan can't know. So they're going to have to speculate, like, can a pro even contact Valve? If they contact Valve, does Valve? They don't know. But I can tell you from behind the scenes, there are tons of stories among pro players of times they tried contacting Valve, or times they literally, like, I've often told an anecdote on By the Numbers. I've kept the name of the person secret just because they've never wanted to be public, where basically a top pro sent Valve an email, and he even had someone like check that his English and his grammar was all good. So it would be like, it would make sense, because he wasn't a native English speaker. And all it did was, it was explaining why he thought the metagame had like problems with it, and why, I won't say what year it is, and this won't even give it away, but why certain guns that had been added sort of were like spoiling the way the game was working and stuff. So this could, I mean, what's great about that example is that could be last year, that could be 5 years ago, that could be the beginning of the game. But basically, he did it basically in the most polite way. Put it this way, I wouldn't do that. Like, when I've met Valve in person, I wasn't as polite as this guy. But basically, he did, like, as far as I could tell, everything you'd want a pro player to do if they were going to send you feedback. And this is not a joke. He never got a reply to the email. And some of the Valve devs who were friends with him on Steam just unfriended him.
Of
now,
course.
The reason why I bring that up, that's obviously probably the most extreme example. I don't think they do that to other people. But what I'm pointing out there is, if you're a fan, you're probably thinking like, was it some sort of mistake? That doesn't make sense. No, what I'm pointing out here is, a lot of game devs, and Valve to some degree seem to be in this category, maybe not entirely like a Riot Games or a Blizzard. The game devs' philosophy, if you're a pro player, genuinely tends to be, I made this game. I am your benevolent God who created your career. You should be grateful that you have a career. I gave it to you. And so please be only ever polite about everything you ever say to me, otherwise I'll never do anything. Whereas what I would hope they would do is, bearing in mind, there are two aspects to the game. There's the game itself, which is just people playing matchmaking. That's totally Valve's domain, their purview. They make all the money off it, great. But the pro side, one thing we have to do, this is why I always say I want IP rights to get smashed with game devs in the future in class action lawsuits, is I want there to one day be a way that we can make the case that people weren't watching Starcraft in 2010 because Blizzard made an awesome fucking RTS game in 1997. They were watching Starcraft in 2010 because of all those amazing Korean players and the incredible system they built up, which had nothing to do with Valve making a video game somewhere in America in 1997 or whatever it was. So in the same sense, what makes the pro scene a massive thing, which in the future and potentially now can make Valve money as well as the game, is all the players and all stuff. So the point is, you have to treat that differently, and you have to understand it's its own world. It really is its own ecosystem, and you have to mentally at least separate it from just random players. Because yeah, that's my main issue. Is like, I do feel like Valve has a responsibility for that, especially because it's not like they've shown no interest in the pro scene. They've set up the majors, they've set up the cases and all these. So they've shown like that they acknowledge the pro scene exists. So I'm not even asking for some like overall control. Like, you notice I don't ask for Riot style, like, take over everything, Valve, take over the leagues, take up. No, I don't want that. I actually like that they leave it at the moment for competent third parties to run. It's just these are the cases where those third parties can't do anything. Like, as we've seen, all they can do is ban you from their tournaments and ask other people to. But that's that. They can only ask. Valve can actually tell people to do it.
One of the silver linings that I've seen circulated when it comes to this sort of public response to the whole coaching scandal when it initially came out was, of course, that because it seems like it was only ever abused online, because it would be very difficult logistically to actually abuse the bug on LAN. One of the things that I kept seeing was, well, at least it was only online and most of those matches are not really that meaningful. Now, putting aside the fact that a lot of LAN qualifiers were online, and obviously that does jeopardize which teams can actually make it out. And even if you go back far enough, like when NIP failed one of the major qualifiers a couple of years back, there was, a lot of speculation that, well, maybe the online qualifiers are not the way to go because of the fact that even an elite team or a team that could be in the running for a decent finish at the major couldn't make it because of the circumstances at which the qualifiers were at. Now we've got to go recontextualize all of that with the knowledge that a lot of teams, especially in some of those online qualifiers, presumably would have been potentially abusing it. Do you think that it is actually a silver lining that, or do you think that there's like some sort of muster to the claim that this was an online only thing? Or do you think we should be concerned about potential abuse at LAN as well? I mean, given the fact that it's kind of a conspiratorial angle to take, but the potential could be that this was known by coaches who played at LAN, and we don't know what the salaries or the moral character of the referees may have been. Like, there's obviously an angle where they could have potentially bribed them, or they could have potentially done something else to abuse this bug. Do you think that sort of approach would be something we should look into, or is it safely an online only thing in your mind?
I actually think there's an angle. I teased it on by the numbers, but I didn't like go into it as a main point. So people probably didn't really catch it. But probably the more far-reaching implication that no one's thought about is this. We can only catch people who use the bug in online games that we have the demo of. So essentially, it needs to be an official game from pro teams against other pro teams where the demo was recorded. So what that means is, as long as this bug has existed, now admittedly, based on the limited things I know, I believe this is a part that other people have gotten lost on. The bug that existed maybe back in 2015, I believe, was the one where it just happens sort of like randomly. And then once it happens, you can abuse it. I think the ones that you can sort of trigger and like constantly use were more like this year and last year. That was like what was intimated to me, at least from some of the coaches. So it's not as bad as it's going to initially sound. But think about this for a second. That means, in theory, any coach, pick the best coaches ever, could have been using it in practice because no one can ever catch them there. So when they were having scrims online, which is what they base what they're going to do at the LAN tournament. So, for example, Astralis plays FaZe online, and Complexity plays whoever you might be, and EG plays Team Liquid. Like, the whole point is these teams all scrim each other, and potentially when they boot camp, they even scrim before the majors and stuff. So it doesn't matter whether someone did it in official play or at the major or at a LAN tournament. They could actually have had practice unduly benefiting them. So an example would be, if you were a very tactical team and you were only using this in scrims when the other team couldn't check either, and you were just looking, like you had the equivalent of some of those rounds that we saw in those clips where the guy's just in the spawn calling all the rotations and who's got the fastest spawn to look at, like that could actually basically tear apart the other guy's player book even more so than what you would have gotten out of the scrim, because you can see how it starts. You can see the setup. You might even see some of the flashes and the smokes they're lining up. Like, in theory, the actual implications are way more far-reaching than people realize. It's just that the problem is we'll never know that. Like, we can never actually find out if that's the case. So it's like with a lot of cheating that never got caught. I always say this, unless in the case like of the demos where you could go back in history, like the best example is like the flusha example. It's irrelevant whether you do think flusha cheated or not. We're never going to get evidence. There is no evidence on cold storage, as it were, that you can pull out and then test and see if he cheated. So as a result, effectively, you have to just forget about it and go on with your life. It's a fun what if. You can do a hypothetical. So unfortunately, it actually could have had a way bigger impact than people realize. Like, I can just imagine how much a really good coach. I mean, all I'll do is give the analogy, because if anyone doesn't know American football, this is basically the most notorious scandal associated with the best football team of the last like 30 years, the New England Patriots, is that they've repeatedly been it's been implied that they were like recording the other team's practice. You get what I'm saying here, guys? That's literally what this fucking bug let you do. So imagine someone was doing that potentially for years in scrims. Now, I don't think they were, and I think it would be very rare that you would find someone who might have just abused it that much. So luckily, if anything, they're probably not competent enough to only use it privately and then never use it once publicly. Like that probably does narrow down an incredibly small Venn diagram. But the point I'm getting to is it could have happened, and that's the terrifying angle, because I can't imagine how much extra like info you could get sort of reconnaissance wise. And the worst thing, again, like I alluded to at the beginning, is the other team would never know you'd gotten it. They don't know that you're just in their spot. So as a result, they're not going to change things up. They're not going to know you're even seeing that. So I hope it never affected the game. But the fact that that is sort of could have even been abused like that, it's way more important than just like an online qualifier game that people might think, like you're saying, you know.
Well, the online qualifiers and stuff like that are certainly another angle. I mean, this is something you brought up on the recent By the Numbers as well. I think it was the Pro 100 team that ended up disbanding after losing over and over again to a team whose coach had abused the bug. And I'm not sure if it was confirmed for those specific matches, but it's sort of circumstantial evidence as far as that team that coach abused the bug, and then following their victories over this team, they ended up disbanding. Aside from that one example where people seem to have understood, the public by and large understood that this could have far-reaching ramifications, even if it was only online play back in the day, I feel like most people have downplayed the significance, partially because we generally as a scene downplay the significance of online results. So it's like if you're only cheating in what feels like meaningless results, for some people it seems to have downplayed the significance of the fact that you were cheating, which is of course the main story. It doesn't really matter the circumstances. Do you think that this is an example of the public like focusing on the wrong things here, where they're saying they see the sentence cheating in an online match or the phrase cheating in an online match, and they focus on the online match part instead of the cheating? Is this just like an extension of what we were talking about earlier with people's responses to individual coaches? Or like what's your take on the public reaction to this particular part of it, the fact that it was so online focused?
Well, the weird thing is the public reaction seems to generally be as if it wasn't cheating. Like I alluded to before, like they act as though it was more compact. Like I don't think people get it. Doing a boost that happens to look at some textures that are bad, that is technically banned. Like you're not allowed to do it, which is why the Olafmeister boost was banned. But first of all, that wasn't even the intention. And secondly, that is way more minor than actually using a wall hack, which is essentially what this cheat is. Like I think actually if people had understood from day one that this is cheating, this really is like using a wall hack, I think you would get a very different response. If anything, the funny thing is, it means that I get put in a very weird position where it sounds like I'm one of the ones pushing for the harshest punishment. Whereas if you notice, if it's ever incidents about real match fixing or real cheating, I'm always the one going the other way. Like, let's just only ban them for 2 or 3 years and then see if they come back. And everyone's like, well, it's a cheater, always a cheater. The only good cheater is a dead cheater. Like, it's all that shit, you know, like normally people are so hard the other way down because think about it, right? I also think this ties into it. The problem is this: when someone does literally use cheats in the game, like apparently KQLY did because he got VAC banned, what happens to fans, this has always been my opinion, is like it's a pretty cynical angle, but it's also just my observation of human nature. Sadly, most people really are so narcissistic that when they talk about what a pro player did, secretly, they're just talking about themselves still. So what they really mean is, like, it's a disgrace that this guy cheated against those other players. What they mean is, it's a disgrace that I was ever cheated against in my matchmaking games by that guy who was obviously cheating when he came. Look, bro, he just came around the corner and just one banged me in the head immediately. He was still moving and everything. Like, they're just thinking, they're getting like a virtual PTSD, thinking of all the times in games they think they were cheating against and that their experience was ruined. And so they think, right, fuck cheaters, because what they're thinking is, I wish cheaters were wiped off the face of the planet. They didn't exist in the game. But for some weird reason, because this case doesn't really sort of resonate with a fan, like they're not going to be playing in a pro game where the other coach was somehow triggering a bug where you can see some things, but how much does that really matter? And it was like, like I think there's enough like abstraction in the case and enough like nuance and things that they've never experienced that somehow it doesn't like properly click with them. And in fact, you actually see this quite a lot, I would say, in things like politics and stuff. People will want an actual like death penalty for one human who did a fucked up offense against another person. But if one human just like steals billions of dollars and like irrevocably just wrecks like thousands of lives, maybe causes suicides, business, somehow they think that guy, oh, it's fine. That's just a blue collar crime. He can just go to prison for like 5 years. I've always thought, what the fuck is that proportion like? But that's the point, is like when you can't sort of like instantly one-to-one relate it to your life and your experience, it's actually hard for people to kind of know where they stand on that. And so I think personally, they just let like others tell them. So you have to factor this in as well. Remember, in esports at least, most fans just go whatever direction their favorite player is kind of pointing, as in like they just ride with their favorite players, like they like the player, so if they can, they like his opinion. So, well, remember, because it's their coaches or it's their ex-coach or it's their friend's coach, you'll notice a lot of pro players have come way out on the leniency side of this. The only ones who are kind of like fire and brimstone were the ones where they either directly got cheated against, obvious reasons there, or they just aren't in any way almost connected to someone who did the cheating. You know, I've seen a lot of pros have sort of been on the angle of like, well, he only did it for one round, or well, he's accepted his responsibility, so let's all agree to forgive him. So I think fans rather will be influenced by that. Like they'll see that the way their players are reacting and they'll kind of go along with it, I think.
Well, it's talking about proportions anyway. I did want to talk about the actual duration of some of these bans, because obviously we talked earlier about the iBuyPower case. Those players were indefinitely banned, and that case is pretty much synonymous with like CSGO scandal or whatever. You know, it's definitely a very high profile case that people who weren't around during the time will almost always find enough content after the fact, like some of Richard Lewis's videos that break it down, and they'll eventually be brought up to speed to some degree anyway. So since that's like a very high profile case that we can point to as a comparison, obviously permanent bans still not lifted to this day, even though the players are no longer playing. It is very off to one side of the spectrum, very, very harsh in that sense. And many people would argue overly harsh, like you were talking about earlier. There should be some sort of period for rehabilitation. And contrasting that to the coach punishments, where things are in some cases they were reduced to like 85% the original duration because of like, you know, that people allowing like certain data to come out, or they're helping with the investigation itself. Or they just accept the ban for, you know, there's a lot of like small things that ESIC sort of took into calculations when they were actually designing the bans themselves and determining how long they would be. What's your take on the punishments that have actually been doled out? Do you think, like, is it a case by case basis, or do you think generally it's like either all too harsh, all too soft, all fair? What's your take on that?
I think the tough thing for me is it's kind of a mixed bag for me. Like, for example, if you want to go on sort of the softest, most lenient end, it would be the people who did use the bug, but they didn't like use the bug. Like the bug happened, and then where they fucked up is they didn't disconnect from the server or instantly inform the admins. They just sort of like claim I alt-tabbed or I walked away or whatever. So essentially they're people where it doesn't matter that they say, but honestly, I didn't get anything from it, because it's like, yeah, but the move is to disconnect. That's the only answer. You won't get anything out of being on the server, so that doesn't make sense, like that angle. So to me, that's kind of like, that is like a dog ate my homework type thing. It's like, okay, you know what? You didn't intend to fuck up entirely, but like, you did fuck up. So like you should get a punishment. So for those ones, I actually feel like those ones where some of them have only got in a few months, that's probably reasonable. Like I think you should have something like that, not least because I hope going forwards, the logic's going to be, people are going to be hyper alert now. If anything happens that can potentially give you an advantage, you instantly disconnect and you instantly inform the admin. So I think that sets a good precedent. My problem is when you get into the other ones. Like, first of all, I've made this point everywhere I've talked about this issue for the last month or so, but I fucking hate this angle that you get a reduced sentence for just coming forwards and saying, like, yeah, I did it. It's like, yeah, but based on what? Like, that should have been a reduced sentence if you came forwards years ago. If you came forwards before this was ever put, like, if that happened, I maybe would be in, like, for example, those stories where they claim that, like, I think they say Lord and Peter and maybe even the Raging guy, I believe some of these people, it was claimed at some point before it was made public, have either tried to come to Valve or TOs, or maybe even when the initial bug was announced by the Mihao guy, they've come forward and said, right, if you give those people a reduced sentence, I could maybe get it, because that kind of shows that they're like trying to alert people of the wider problem. So potentially their actions could have prevented future people being able to cheat, or it could actually get the problem resolved. That person, I don't mind you giving a reduction to. This weird thing that ESIC did, where it was like, right, we've got 2 weeks, and in the next 2 weeks, if you come forwards and say you're sorry, you get a reduced penalty. I still don't get it, because everyone's arguing against me, right? Like using like real police cases of like, yeah, but that might have helped the person. It wasn't. They were going to go through all the demos anyway. They were going to catch all the people anyway. By the way, even if the person admits it, they still have to go through their demos and test it. So as far as I can tell, that just means that some people have gotten a reduced sentence in a scenario where the first people to get caught never got that chance. Like, I think that is whack, actually. I'm personally not in favor of that. So those bans, I don't think they should have gotten the reduction, essentially. They cheated, they did the crime. Doesn't matter that they're sorry. That just means, in my opinion, they shouldn't get they shouldn't have the book thrown at them. They shouldn't have, like, the worst possible scenario. I do think, by the way, the people who cheated, maybe even the same amount, but then denied it constantly, like Dead, I think they should get an increased ban because they've just shown they have no remorse. Like, they don't actually think this is cheating or bad behavior. And even worse, if anything, this shouldn't necessarily be the end of the world, but they are trying to turn people against the very process that has investigated and uncovered what they've done. That probably should get you, like, the book thrown at you. You should get probably the max sentence. But my other issue is this, is a lot of the bans you can argue for or against if they're in isolation. But I also get really lost when I look at the totality of the bans, how many people were banned and for how long, because I don't get this angle. Like, listen, I'm not going to be the idiot fan who says, but he only, like, you know, when they started out, like, but it happened in one round, so maybe he didn't know. And it's like, right, move the goalposts. Well, we've just found out he did know, but he only did it for one round. It's like, no one would ever say that about a wall hack. No one ever in the history of the world would say, you only used a wall hack to win a 1v3 in one round, but then he turned the wall hack off. So is it that big a deal? No one would say that. But my problem is this. At the same time, cheating for one round is very different from cheating for 30 rounds. So I'm amazed that there are things where people have done 1 or 2 rounds or one map and they're getting like 5 months, 6 month ban. And then surely the guy who cheated for like 3 maps, listen, if it's not lifetime, make it effectively a lifetime ban. Make it like a 15-year ban or something, you know. Maybe that's the way you do it. Because like at that point in time, dude, he cheated for 30 times more. How can that be? Like, that's disproportionate, his punishment. Like, again, like I say, if not lifetime, he should get the most, you figure out what the most extreme ban possible is, and he should get it. Because in that scenario, that's one thing I've never understood. Essentially, you just said, everyone out there who only cheated for a couple of rounds, joke's on you, dickhead, you should have cheated for like 10. You're going to get punishment roughly the same anyway. Like, that doesn't make sense to me. Not for the future and not for the fairness of, if I'm punished, the minimum I want to know is that when I look at the other people, fight, oh, we were all punished on the same metrics. Like, oh, okay, that's fine then. Yeah, okay. The system works, as it were. Yeah. At the moment, the system is pretty willy-nilly once you go between people, as far as I can tell.
I was curious about, I'm not sure if this is something you can comment on, but obviously one of the things that you mentioned a few by the numbers back was that you had actually reached out to the Flashpoint admins and had them look into some of these cases and, you know, ask if you would be mirroring the bans essentially. And they had said something to the effect of the fact that they need to go and conduct their own investigation to verify the ESIC investigation itself. Are you able to comment any further on that? Has there been any more news that, you know, you're free to talk about?
Yeah, it's basically the same situation because that's just basically the process of how we'd have to handle it. Like, the main issue is this. Yeah, in theory, I actually trust that Mihao and people from ESL and people from CS Summit, that when they've done their due diligence, that they actually did get to the bottom of it and find that the people did the cheat. The problem is, though, if we are going to ban them from our system, I believe that actually, though, the people within, in this case, Face It, who told me that that's what they'd have to do. I think they're right. Like, logically, you should also do your due diligence and test that's correct, because you don't want to live in a world of corruption where maybe one TO banned you and then everyone just mirrors it without even questioning it, and then that corruption can creep in the scene. So the point is, you can't just instantly do it. You can't essentially just say, like, yeah, good idea, like, I'll just do what you're doing. You have to also ask them, like, can I see the evidence? Can we review it? But it is actually, I am going to push, I already have been, basically, for exactly that. I want us to mirror their bans, or potentially, I mean, we'd have to get to the bottom of all the evidence. In certain cases, maybe we make the ban longer, because like I said, some of them I don't think should have reductions. So I personally think we should mirror all of them, even though, as you pointed out, when actually, it was actually Mihao and those other people were the ones who checked. They just also checked the Flashpoint demos. There actually was no incident, apparently, of someone doing it in the Flashpoint 1. Now, I don't know if that's still the case. Technically, they hadn't run through all the demos, but I believe they said they'd run through all Season 1's demos and that there was nobody. So technically, we don't have to ban anyone, but I think we should, because as I alluded to before, I think the whole scene should just pull together, mirror all the bans, and essentially that's like it's not literally the same as Valve coming in and block banning you, but it's effectively the same, isn't it? Like, you sort of have the same impact. Like, I don't want it to be, for example, this is the reason I thought of it initially. I don't want that to be a reason that now a bunch of those coaches want to come to Flashpoint teams, is because you can just do it in Flashpoint. Like, yes. So you can't just come and cheat here. So no, and we haven't done it yet, but I'm pretty sure we will mirror, or have our own system of bans for the same people. So, for example, even though he's not in MIBR right now, if Dead had still been in MIBR, yes, there would have been some sort of prohibition from playing in Flashpoint 2, as far as I know.
Now, I have a couple of other questions that are not directly related to the coaching scandal, but I did want to ask before we move on if there's anything that any thoughts that you've seen that maybe haven't been touched on as much, or any ideas that you've had in terms of like a historical angle to attack, and sort of reiterating the initial question of whether or not this is. I mean, obviously, we talked about the fact that it seems to be like the worst scandal when it comes to like a breach of ethics, but is there some way that this actually directly impacts the earlier results? I mean, because a lot of it feels like you can't know whether or not it was deliberate. Apparently it's not even something that was possible to make deliberate back in 2015, 2016, so on. How much of an impact does this actually make to some of the earlier results and like to the legacies in a way of some of these careers? Do you have any thoughts on that? Because that's not something I've seen discussed at all, basically.
Yeah, the main issue is if you look at how many times people had cheated and when, a lot of it was obviously more recently, and it was in matches which, listen, like the Dead one where he cheated in part of a qualification process for the World Championship, that's a massive scandal. Some of the other ones were like, is anyone really going to give a fuck that like Hunden cheated in like a DreamHack Masters that was online if we like 3 years from now we're at a LAN? Probably not. Like, those ones will somewhat, like the crime won't be forgotten, but like, as you all alluded to, like the match itself wasn't as important. Like, it wasn't some epic game that decided the fate of some team. That's why I also think that's why the Olaf Pass boost got so much acclaim as well. Remember, it was like the end of the deciding map of a fucking quarterfinal of a major. Like, yeah, it had enormous implications. And the thoughts at the time was whoever wins that match will win the major. Spoiler, they did. So that one is one of those ones where it really is like some like fucking Back to the Future moment that all of history hinges on that moment. And there's a big what if to be asked of if that didn't happen. My problem is this. I don't think, for example, to tie it back to the first part of this interview, I don't think this is like the whole reason, for example, that online was less legit than offline, but I will tie it into this. This is why online play will never have the credibility of offline play, no matter even if you get it so that like people are all in studios and everything's a stream. Somehow the problem is whenever there's an online component, there is basically always more possibility to cheat in some sense. So even though people wouldn't know it, if you don't literally enforce certain standards with pro players, they are always looking for an edge. The point is, once you go outside of the like blatantly immoral to like the gray area of is that sort of unethical, you will find loads of pros. So back in the day in 1.6, for example, the number one way that you make an online game totally illegitimate is they would all constantly lie about what servers they had good pings to just gamesmanship each other and get the best server for them for that match. So people would be doing shit, and this isn't speculation. Some of these people were even friends of mine and did shit like this. They would do stuff like if they were an American team and you're trying to do that thing where you like triangulate the best server for both teams, that you all join 2 or 3 and then you see, oh, here's the average ping. I know some of them who told me they would just do shit like join the server and then just like quickly pull the RJ45 out of the network router and then quickly back in so that, oh, I'm getting a ping spike. It went to 300 there. Nah, it's bad routing for me. They would just, like, even though that sounds very minor, if you consistently lie and get slightly better ping for you and slightly worse ping for the opponent, you're going to win a couple of matches off that, or a couple of rounds off that, or maybe even just a couple of kills, whatever it is. That is unethical. Like, you're being dishonest, and you were basically on a very, very, very low level cheating. But my point is, that was rampant in Counter-Strike, especially back in the day. So then let's go to other aspects. So I'm amazed that people used to push back on me in CSGO that online results are worthless. Because in CSGO, we always had fucking streams. At least in 1.6, there weren't streams until like the latter half of the 2010s or whatever, the 2000s rather. CSGO has been streamed the whole time. So that means every online game, not only the coaches, but all the players could have had a second monitor with the fucking stream pulled up. And anyone who goes like, yeah, but Thorin, there's a delay. That doesn't mean you don't get any information. That means I know your buying patterns. I know where you hid last round on a boost that I didn't see, that you never killed it. Like, I know a million things. And by the way, if I hope that this cheating incident makes people think of this, yes, we don't know if everyone's doing that. In fact, I'd guess of the majority, I'd guess there's a lot that aren't. But I tell you what, I guarantee there's a lot who were and always were doing shit like this and were getting every little edge they could because there was no way to check and there was no way to punish them. So unfortunately, this is one of the reasons why online play will never be as legitimate. It's because unfortunately you can't have a guy in the room literally just watching what they're doing and ensuring that people don't at least sort of like push the envelope. And unfortunately, this ends up being our equivalent in esports of the shit that we all hate in real sports, where nowadays in so many sports, every offensive player lies to try and get a foul or pretends that some bullshit happened, or even when someone throws the ball and obviously goes off their leg, they say, it's the other team and point at them like no one likes that. We all feel like it's whack because like you can see on camera, this guy's just a liar. And unfortunately, we have our own versions online where people have been doing all kinds of crazy shit for years and years now, I'm afraid.
Well, speaking of crazy shit that's been going on, I don't know, for years, but probably we can speculate, is there's an upcoming ESIC investigation for NA-MDL match fixing, which is certainly going to turn some heads, I think, when it drops, just based on what I've heard about the number of teams that are implicated in this. And maybe it's only one player or the coach or whatever regarding this particular case, but needless to say, it's a significant portion of the scene, right? And certainly it's a non-trivial issue. And seeing as how it's coming on the coattails of this coaching thing, and another sort of narrative or concern that people have had, specifically regarding the NA scene, Richard Lewis alluded to this on one of the episodes of By the Numbers recently, was that the NA scene has been sort of poached and mined for talent, with the Valorant exodus obviously coming into play. There's a lot less of the up-and-coming like tier 2 and tier 3 scene that kind of bottomed out in that respect. Not only that, but you've also got it's a little bit less of a direct connection, but obviously Henry G going over to Cloud9, Moses going over to Team Liquid in various roles of the organization. There's going to be a few more that I'm sure will follow suit as a result of that. I mean, it's sort of a situation where you get a couple of people who are trying to trailblaze in that respect, and that gets other companies interested in, maybe we could go and look in the same sort of area for talent that might be interested in coming on and changing jobs, changing positions. And in the same way, I just feel like there's a dire look for a lot of the jobs within the NA scene, a lot of the positions, and in a lesser extent as well, the broadcast talent, because these are some of the biggest names in that particular space. So my question to you is, do you think that CSGO's scene, specifically when it comes to NA and broadcast talent, do you think that there's going to have to be some sort of period of rebuilding after this? Do you think it's potentially even more ill-fated than that, like it could go even worse, or do you think maybe some of the concerns that people have had are actually overblown when it comes to these things?
The main problem I see is that what's brutal is because MDL is basically the level below like pro play in Counter-Strike, what we think of as like tier 1, bordering tier 2, etc. The real tough thing that people aren't thinking about is at the moment, NA has one of the most talent-rich scenes in the whole game, especially because everyone speaks English, and within that one, essentially continent of North America, you can all play with each other, which is an advantage that Europeans don't have, actually. Like, you can't just throw a Russian guy with a French guy with a guy from Denmark and expect it to go great. It might not. So at the moment, they have an amazing scene. But if you think about it, right, if enough people get at least tainted by that MDL match fixing scandal, that could just cut out the entire grassroots. So the point is, the next twists, Stewie 2K, Elite, might just never get to come through the game. They might be done immediately now. And I can tell you, because North America had this when CGS took place, when you miss a generation of talents, listen, as long as you're a region that isn't like starved of people, like South Korea or something, if you're a place like Russia, USA, Sweden, there's always going to be some talent comes eventually. You're going to get there. But if you miss a generation, you miss a generation. Like, you have to wait now and have a barren period where the no talent comes through, or the talent that does come through isn't that good. Or in this case, they've gone to another game, they've been eliminated, they've maybe cheated even. So I think that's a problem. In terms of like talent leaving and going to other roles, that's actually one of the things that's very tough about CSGO right now. So if you go back in time, like 3 or 4 years ago, we all wanted all the like really good but low fragging IGLs to retire so they could be the coaches. Because at the time we didn't have good enough coaches. And if you notice, right, overwhelmingly, that has happened as a drift. Like, you've seen people start to transition over in that role. Some of them become very good at it. Like Hunden, if he hadn't been banned now, would have been the best example of it. He got to coach at a much higher level than he could as a player, and he got to have a great impact on the team. God B has been influential within what Big's done. There's a bunch of good examples of it. But the real tough thing is at the moment, there still needs to be way more people who are like, basically, the key thing is, it's not just about how good you are. It's you need to be a lifer. If you look at any sport, the real reason why the GM in any sport can himself make the decision, like, right, I'm going to stake my whole career on this running back, on this fucking shooting guard, on this draft pick that I'm going to make from a trader deal. It's because he knows the game. He spent his whole life in American football, in American basketball, in ice hockey. He spent his whole life in the game, and he's got the eye test. He knows the game at the very minimum on a feel level, on an eye test level, even if he maybe doesn't know every advanced statistic or all that stuff. But at the moment in Counter-Strike, we don't have anyone like that. Like, most of the GMs are people who are just on the organization side and for a couple of years, or they come from another game, or they're just working in team organizations. Like, oh, as the general manager, I just make sure we have a team in Smash Brothers and this. Like, they're not lifers of Counter-Strike. So basically, even though in the short term it's actually going to make like broadcasts worse, unfortunately, a lot of the best people who could do this role currently are players, coaches, and broadcast talent, because they're the people. Like, think about Henry G. The guy's been in Counter-Strike for like 15 years or something. He's competed as a player. He's been on camera a billion times. Same with Moses. Moses was literally playing at a CPL I went to in like 2004. Like, this guy has been there for the whole time. So as much as it means we're actually going to unfortunately lose some of our brilliant people who on camera shows the way the game's supposed to be played, explain it to us, set up the narratives, I think actually we sort of need to take the hit. And in the short term, we need some of those people to go, get into the teams and build up the teams. Because at the moment, people don't make use of the talent they have anyway. That's probably the biggest crime. And so that's why the Valorant drain hasn't been the top players, but it's been some players where if they'd understood the scene and the rest of the scene had understood their value, some of them, if not now, within 6 months, would have been in top teams potentially if they stuck around.
Yeah, Wardell's an example that you tout often. Obviously, more recently, we have Som and Daps, who are obviously big in the NA scene for various points of their career. Daps a little bit more so, considering he's touted as like a team building IGL in that sense. So yeah, definitely, it seems like it's a bit of a loss, and hopefully, like you say, there's going to be a period of rebuilding there. I have a sort of a follow-up question here regarding specifically like the MDL stuff and how it might end up going across over to Valorant, because a lot of the players who match fixed in MDL or allegedly match fixed in MDL, as far as I understand, are also players who have since departed for Valorant. And in a situation like that, there's been a case where people are asking, what happens to those players when the ESIC investigation comes in and they are banned from Counter-Strike, even though they're not playing the game anymore? Will Riot end up enforcing it? Will this in some way like stack all the way back up to the iBuy power bans of many years past and potentially endanger the careers of those pros as well? Like, that's been in the back of some people's minds as a concern. Since you obviously have a long and storied relationship with Riot Games down the years, you might have a little bit more insight to this than many other people who I've seen speak out on it. What is your take on, like, if you could imagine a prediction, sort of figure out what you might shadowbox and what the result might be? Do you think Riot would end up banning or enforcing the bans of people who had at least recently been found at match fixing in MDL?
No, I actually think they not only won't do anything at all, I don't think they'll even address it. I think they will literally act that it doesn't exist, because to them, again, this is actually basically, if you don't want these people to be banned, obviously I don't know where people's stances on this. I personally think they probably shouldn't be. It's a different game. But I think luckily the narcissism of those game devs of like, my game is the whole world and it's all that matters, actually in this sense means that they'll be like, well, they didn't do it in my game, so who cares? Like, in that sense, I don't think they actually care what the other people do, because if you look at the precedent, I think Overwatch is probably the best example. In Overwatch, you had people who had literally, I mean, there's a famous example. It's actually known. He plays now in Valorant and FaZe Clan. Baby Bay literally cheated in Counter-Strike. Like, he had an account that was banned, but he was a pro player in Overwatch. He was actually a very competent player. Obviously, in the early days of Overwatch, before OWL began, Team Liquid used to have a bunch of the ex-iBuy power players and people like that were in the game. Steel was trying to be a pro in Overwatch. Like, the precedent in the past, at least, has been not to mirror bans like this. It's mainly because also, like, if you notice, game devs just aren't really hooked into like the competitive sporting side of the game as much. They only tend to tangentially look across it. So I actually don't think anything will happen at all in that case. And I'm not personally in favor of it. Like, to me, just not being able to play Counter-Strike is the ban. I don't really give a fuck if you then go and start a new game over, because it's such a different skill set. It's far from certain you're going to succeed. Like, it's not like people might imagine. Like, this is like put it this way. I guess the analogy would be like this. If someone got banned from like kickboxing, but he could then go and do like wrestling, it's not really the same sport, is it? Like, so if he can go and be wicked in that, fair play. It's going to be hard for him either way.
Well, one of the things that people have been saying as far as Riot goes is that they have been sort of hyping up the fact that Riot is very concerned with their public image, and people have then, as a result, speculated that they might take a special interest to this particular case. Is this something where you think like those kinds of thoughts are a little bit misplaced or overblown? Like, because you're saying now, your belief is that they won't actually do anything, but some people who have been arguing for or at least been like shadowboxing and thinking they might actually ban them, or they should ban them for PR reasons or something. Like, there's an argument to be made for it. Do you think Riot would even consider it?
I think Riot are also kind of like Valve in the sense that they don't just act based on like their own like feelings towards the case. Like, am I disgusted by this? Is this important? Do I not really care? I don't think they actually think that. I think in line, I do agree with you. I think they are very PR conscious, but only after the fact. So as in, if someone comes in and tells the guy like, sir, the whole world's on fire because of something, like that's when they start getting worried. Like, whoa, what can we do with this PR? So the main problem I have is, like, if you notice, there seems to be almost no overlap between CSGO and Valorant as esports, in the sense that, like, this is a fairly minor side angle to the cheating scandal. Like, people in Valorant don't seem to be that interested in it as a topic. Doesn't seem like it's a massive, like, community earth-shaking move, So the problem is, I don't think there's enough, like, public pressure or momentum behind it in this community that Valve think they Riot rather have to address it and, like, must do something in this game. And so all I would say is this: I know of cases in Asian League of Legends where there was match fixing, there was people illegally owning two teams, there was all sorts of shit that went on. That behind the scenes, these were like semi-open secrets who these people were doing it. And some of them, by the way, went on to be champions, accomplish great things in the game, be legacy players. And Riot never did anything whatsoever to, or even attempted to investigate these people. And as far as I can tell, that's why I bring that case up. It's because it was only like an open secret behind the scenes. Nobody in public ever knew or ever even suspected that these people had done this. So I think there are certain sort of Pandora's boxes that Riot, if they haven't been opened yet, in a sense, they're smart enough to just leave closed and just say, just leave that be,
One of the sort of narratives that's been happening lately regarding specifically the exodus into Valorant as well has been something where, people are obviously moving away from Counter-Strike and a little bit away from Overwatch as well. Like, it's sort of poaching players or taking players from those other scenes. And I'm reminded, of course, when Valorant launched, it tried to play the angle that it was the CSGO killer or was going to somehow replace CSGO in some way. And I am reminded of something somewhat similar. Like, people had concerns in the scene that maybe Overwatch would do the same thing back in, I think it was 2016 or something, when the game initially launched. So this is a case where obviously we can look at that and almost scoff at it like it was a ridiculous notion. Some people called it, before it even happened, that it wasn't going to compete. I mean, the prevailing narrative seems to have been that Counter-Strike is just eternal anyway because it's been around for so long. It's stood the test of time. The question that I have for you is, do you suspect that some of the pros and maybe some of the coaching staff or like the support staff who have gone over to Valorant, especially once like people have thought maybe the money is going to dry up, like the salaries are going to sort of collapse after a certain point because it's just very overinflated right now, many people have said. So like, do you think there's going to be a case where we're going to see people like announcing their unretirement, like they're back in the game when it comes to Counter-Strike? Do you think they're going to be coming back over, or do you have any sort of thoughts on that?
The tough thing is, if you look at because probably the best control group we can set up is if you go and look how Overwatch was for the first few years. Because even though Blizzard weren't like overt in the same way Riot was, I guess Riot didn't say it publicly, they just said it privately. Like, Blizzard sort of did the same thing. They left it for like a year and a half before they did Overwatch League. So there was like third-party circuit where people ran tournaments. You got to kind of like get a feel for the game. And that was actually the period when the game was popping off. I mean, the joke is when they actually launched the Overwatch League, it was basically dead man walking already. Like, the game had already sort of like fucking jumped the shark, hadn't it? So that's just unfortunate timing. But the point I'm getting to is, if you look at the way they ran things like that, there was a lot of people went into Overwatch the first year or so who, just because of how scenes are, like, you can be good in the first 3 months and you might never, ever be relevant ever again. You might just be some nobody who gets superseded, or not enough people had come into the game, or not enough tournaments had happened. So there's obviously a lot of people did that. Like, if you look at the people who were on top in the first year in Overwatch, some of them didn't even get into OWL, and then some of them that were in OWL were in the bottom of OWL, and then some of them just cycled out and were on benches, and within a year or so were done. So in that sense, I do think that you will actually see a bunch of people transition back. The problem, and this is going to be their problem, not ours, is when they try to come back to Counter-Strike in a year and a half, that's going to effectively be as if they had just not played any games at all. Now, listen, having played another esport at least means like they mentally might be in a good frame of mind to practice stuff, but it means they're going to have to catch up. Like, they're not just going to come back and instantly start playing Counter-Strike and be as good as they were when they left. And so the real problem is, if you're someone like Daps, maybe some Wardell, maybe these guys can do it. But some of the ones who already were like only just on the cusp of making it into like relevant Counter-Strike, they're probably up shit's creek. Like, what they'll find is they will have just wasted a couple of years. Now, listen, they'll have maybe made a good salary and maybe they increased their brand exposure. Like, they might actually have that angle. The problem is, it's hard to imagine someone who had success in Valorant would be the one that would be then coming back. So if they fail in Valorant and they like didn't have a great time in CS, yeah, I think they're going to be in a bad, like, they're going to kind of have baggage, but come trailing behind them in a sense in that regard. But I do think there'll be a decent wave of people who come back as well.
I want to go back a little bit into Counter-Strike's history for this particular, like, sort of last couple questions here that I have. And one of them is, obviously, we talked about it a little bit earlier, KQLY cheating in Titan, because this is one of the other higher profile cases of breach of ethics, specifically cheating in the pro scene in a way that actually did affect matches and the legacy of players. A lot of people have said that the French scene itself was set back a lot by the fact that KQLY got banned, because obviously that in some ways, maybe people have speculated that, you know, Titan disbanded as a result of that. Like, it was pretty soon after that they had a bit of a fall from grace in that respect. And obviously, I know you've studied this French scene quite a bit, and you made a lot of videos on the topic when it was still fresh in people's minds all the way back in 2014. But I was curious as to your take on, like, just the French scene after the fact. Like, do you think it made a really massive impact to the French scene in a way? Like, should we be sort of concerned about maybe the repeating of history in that respect, where like now we're seeing all these coaches get banned and like tarnishing the reputation of a lot of teams and players and legacies? Do you think something similar could happen? Or like, do you even think that the French scene was like superbly negatively affected by the KQLY ban itself?
I think actually it was. Like, to me, the KQLY ban was one of those like what if moments that all of the French scene's history hinged on, because basically that ban took place before France had won any majors. And if you remember, it was the other team, not KQLY's. He was on Titan, which was basically the very games people. It was actually the people on the other team, the LDLC Envy team, who won the majors for France, and the core of the Titan guys never did. I mean, some of them obviously transitioned over to that team to win the second major. So as a result, like, if you look at the success, France was, at the point of KQLY being banned, the second most successful nationality in the game. It went Sweden number one at the time, number one by far, but then number two was clearly France. And believe it or not, Denmark would be like 3 or 4 on the list. Like, they weren't the dominant force at the time. They weren't winning tournaments. So if you want to say like, what if for the French scene, and then obviously the wider implications of what could happen for the whole scene, it was enormous. Because if people don't know, part of what happened before KQLY got banned was the very first French shuffle, was the one where Titan made this big power play move where they brought in KQLY and Apex and Maniac, and they made this move. And then the LDLC guys made like a super team of the other players that were big names in the scene. And we had this could have been really fascinating, divergent approaches to the game. It was actually comparable to what you had in NA at the time, where you had Cloud9's lineup was going like tactical, and it's like about having people who just do their job in their role. It's not about being the biggest fragger. It's what can you do your job, and therefore the unit will defeat you. And you had the iBuyPower guys who were like, right, let's load up skill. Let's go like Team Liquid does now. More skilled players in the region. We're going to play quite loose, and we're going to see if individually we can beat you. Well, that was kind of the distinction you had. Titan was the team that had just enough skill. I mean, they had Prime Kenny S, so they had enough like superstar potential, but then they had existence, and they had this like tactical approach where they were trying to win the game that way. At the time, obviously, we didn't have what Astralis later did, so people didn't know that could potentially be the best style if you do it. And then you had these LDLC guys who were going the other approach. They were like the FaZe Clan style of like, it's going to be loose strats, but it's going to be all these like power players, and we're just going to hit them hard and see what we can do. Well, the big problem is, just in the same way as the bigger issue of these coaches getting banned is also like the casualties that come along with that. So, for example, heroic players are a good case. We don't know how much heroic players actually benefit from those calls. Listen, they probably did, but I mean in the sense that they might not have been conscious of some of those calls and where they came from. So they already are fucked up. They've lost their coach. They're going to have to get a brand new coach. They might have to learn a new system. They can't get any of the benefits of what they've already built up already. Like, remember, they're a few months into working with that guy's system, a guy who's had success at each level he's played at. So in the same sense, if you think of the KQLY ban, look at what happened to his team afterwards. So afterwards, they lost one of their main star players. So there were no other star players in the whole scene you could recruit. The only other player was basically Scream, and they'd already had Scream in that team for a couple of years before, so they didn't want to go that approach. So if you remember, they had to bring RPK out of retirement. He hadn't played for 2 years. I've told the story many times. They had to essentially sort of like teach him from the ground up how to do the most basic things because he just hadn't been around the pro scene for 2 full years. And then that meant that when Kenny S was what at the time was probably the best player ever in CS, he had a team that wasn't capable of letting him win tournaments. I mean, people know the famous stats where he would have games where he would outfrag everyone and be like plus 30 for the series and lose the series. So there's a 1 if and a half right there. Like a team like that, if they have the proper pieces, it doesn't have to be as good as KQLY, just someone comparable skill-wise. As long as you have that, because in their team, they had just enough skill. They weren't going with like too much skill angle. If you don't have just enough skill, you can't make the rest of it work. It doesn't matter how good you execute the strat if you don't have the firepower to get the kills. So that there's so many what ifs spin off that one. Like Kenny S might have won a tournament in his prime. Titan might have been one of the best dark horses at majors and would have had a chance to win majors. I also think if you just look at Existence's career, he never recovered from that because that was his last ever top lineup. And then after the fact, when they filled a couple more majors, they just booted him and he could never go back again. He had that brief period in G2, which had its own flaws associated with it. So if you want to add on like sort of the second and third tier effects to that, it meant that everyone in the French scene thought, right, Happy's approach, which is kind of like the FaZe Clan, like loose style approach, that's the best way to play Counter-Strike now. And I don't think personally they ever recovered from that. Like they've got a different approach now with Ziwu and Apex being the IGL and this Alex approach the last couple of years. But there was a long, long time where the French scene was stuck in the cul-de-sac of where Happy's style took them, which in the short term got them a couple of majors, but they just didn't evolve beyond that. And I actually think if you look at those G2 teams that had Kenny S and Shocks in them for a couple of years, what a waste of talent that was. You had so many good pieces on paper and you got nothing out of it. So even though it might sound convoluted, KQLY being banned, which then fucked up Titan's talent pool at the time the work players coming through and then made people basically not give a fuck about Existence anymore. I think actually you could track where that had like an insane butterfly effect specifically on the French scene. And then you just look at the fact that something like 1 year after that ban was the last ever major won by a French team. And what have they even done since? I think the deepest they'd been was like Vitality at the last round of 8. That's it. So in some senses, that did completely change. It was like a sea change in terms of the power struggle in World Counter-Strike.
Something that soon followed after KQLY got banned was, of course, like the whole Vax Sucks movement and all of the cases where people were accusing Flusha in particular, but also other pros of cheating. And this is obviously somewhat still a touchy subject in a way where, you know, some people are still curious at the very least, and certainly dubious of the veracity of Flusha's play, whether or not it was like a, you know, cheat assistant essentially. And I was somebody who missed the heyday of all of that. I missed pretty much all of the initial context that's set up. Like for one, we've caught a player cheating in terms of KQLY at the pro scene. And now like we've got a precedent to essentially tar and feather any other pro that seems to be exhibiting similar uncharacteristic forms of play. And to people like myself, when it comes to like, I saw the Flusha clips after the fact and I sort of studied up on it, but still missed a lot of that, like the living through the moment of the history. To people like myself who missed that historical context, how would you actually break down the Flusha case? Because this is obviously something that's still in some ways in people's minds. Is this? I'm obviously not going to ask you to like go on the record regarding whether you think he did or not, because it's almost like irrelevant anyway at this point. I'm just curious about what your take is on like if you had to set it up for people who had really only knew that it had happened but didn't know how or why or any of the details around it. How would you give context to the uninitiated?
Yeah, basically what happened was it was a similar time frame as we're talking about this KQLY thing. I think actually the first clips were maybe, off the top of my head, I think it was actually the same time frame actually that the KQLY ban happened when the first clips were coming online. And the first clip, it was actually just one clip initially, because it was a clip from the major that had happened before, ESL1 Cologne, where in the quarterfinals, Fnatic had played against Na'Vi, and there's a clip that Flusha does on Dust 2, where he's shooting at, I think it's seized from Na'Vi, and he's shooting at him where Flusha's in the A site on CT Dust 2, and Seized, or whoever the Na'Vi player is coming up the like little ramp that the All-Pro always sits on where that box is. He's coming up there, and like bizarrely, like Flusha just sort of like goes on, does the aim lock, and even fires bizarrely through the box that you sort of like can't shoot people through or whatever, just fires for no reason. And that's why people thought it was like an aim lock with like a miss hit or something, you know. And that one clip then, though, started the rabbit hole. Then people started searching for the other clips. And what people found was, even in that same match, like if you go to the Nuke game, which was the deciding map of that match, which actually Fnatic won 16-14. And at the time, by the way, neither team played Nuke. And that was the randomizer that had picked it, that randomizer that was put in for that major. And so this is a map, think about it, that neither team's comfortable on. We don't choose to play it. We've essentially played chicken in the veto by both just letting it go to the end and not vetoing it. It gets picked, and Fnatic wins by the smallest margin you can win a map by. And in that one map, there are like 3 clips that flusha has where he's doing like those move on to move on to move off, what people called aim locks, at least back then. So the problem was, when people started searching, there wasn't just one. There was like a decent couple of handfuls of like suspicious clips from flusha. I'll also point out, people weren't just saying flusha. Like at the time, even Olaf Meister and Crims had a couple of clips where people thought similarly, that in like clutches, they were looking through walls or something. So actually, people forget this now. Everyone thinks it's just flusha. A lot of people in the scene suspected, like they thought when they saw flushers, they thought, just based on the eye test, some people were like, he cheats. That was even privately a thing. There was even a couple of people publicly did. Famously, Shocks did a stream where he literally watched some of the clips and said, essentially the gist of like, I know cheating when I see it. This is cheating, definitely. Look, he is cheating. He later recanted it, but listen, no one had a gun to his head the first time. But the part that people won't know is this. When we actually got to the major, which is obviously only like weeks after all this shit had gone down, like a month later, when we were at the major, this is the part that people have swept under the rug, right? There were players from top teams. Like, I think even famously, Hellraisers, for example, didn't shake the Fnatic players' hands or flusha's hand when they beat them in like the best of one in the group stage there. I think it was even implied, I mean, LDLC themselves, I don't think were fans of all that shit. But like, I won't name some of the other names, but they were like, if of the top 10 teams in the world, I would say at least 3 or 4 teams, I'm talking whole teams, like the majority of these teams, thought that Fnatic cheated, or at the very least that flusha cheated. And as a result, at this actual tournament, were hostile to them. A lot of it off camera or like in lobbies of hotels or after a match where you can't hear what they're saying. But like a whole bunch of other players, this is why the Olaf Pass boost actually became such a pivotal moment of that major. Because even though everyone was publicly talking about the boost and like, is it fair to do that? Should you really what that was spiritually was about all the other teams being like, these fucking guys cheat and now they're going to do it again and get away with it and they're going to win this. That's what like the sentiment was among a bunch of top pros. So that's why if you've never heard this story, I've mentioned it in one of my reflections I did with JW. A lot of people don't know this like what if moment, which is that after that tournament, a bunch of people, and that's implied if you look at all the different interviews with JW and flusha, that it was mainly like Olaf and Crims, like the newer players to the top scene, that they'd already been in Fnatic for a few months at this time. It was implied that these guys literally after that tournament said, we're thinking of just quitting Counter-Strike completely. Like, I don't want this hit every event. I don't want people to think I'm cheating all the time or telling me that if I win, it wasn't legit. So actually, people don't realize that was a way bigger deal at the time than it is now. Because essentially, as crazy as it is, actually, all those teams I'm talking about have somehow managed to put the fucking genie back in the bottle and no one even knows they ever did it. Think about how wild that is to actually privately, and in some cases publicly, cheat accuse someone, and then years later everyone forgets who even did it and they think it's only conspiracy theorists who think that. So all I'll say is, if you're someone who thinks flusha cheated, you are not alone. There were a lot of pros, and I have to say, it's not that they all went and came to me privately and were like, look, we studied the frames like in more detail and look. No, the only reason, I'm not joking, that they recanted was people realized, well, we have no proof. We're never going to catch him. And as time went on, they were like, this is one of the best teams in the world. I'm just going to look like a salty bitch if I keep saying it. And you know what? I'll add it in as well. It might sound fucked up, but it's relevant in terms of the coaching case. They got to know Fnatic players better. And so you know what? When you know a guy and you have a beer with him and he's a nice guy, as fucked as this sounds, it can make a person's brain goes, well, I thought he cheated, but actually he's a nice guy, so maybe he didn't. And people sort of talk themselves out of it. And so I don't think one way or the other, you have to have an opinion on it. Like, for example, we will never catch any of these people if they did cheat. So essentially, we can never know they cheated. But I certainly thought they were suspicious as fuck. I've always maintained it. And just time passing didn't change my mind. I need something to actually, like, dissuade me of that.
Yeah, I was actually curious as to why we never really got like a conclusion. Like you're saying, the genie went back in the bottle, not just for the people who were cheat accusing, but also for the people who were accused in a way. Like it seems like it just fizzled out from my perspective when it comes to like the public consciousness holding them accountable. At some point, they just won enough and they were affable enough in content and situations like that. Enough time passed that it faded from people's memories, unlike what you're talking about with your personal like viewpoint
Well,
on it.
unfortunately, I think that probably connects together with the same point, though, which is that, again, if fans see their favourite player go, well, actually, I apologise now for saying he cheated, they're also going to think, oh, right, well, I guess he didn't cheat. Because remember, the logic always is like, only when it's someone you like, it's like, well, he knows the game better than me. So if he says that, then it's like, yeah, go on. Then he must be right. It's like, well, you're so close, but not the end part. No, unfortunately, I think that is a factor. Like, I think actually people have just sort of like forgiven them because just too much time's passed and they're cool guys or whatever. I will say this though, and it's one of the points I made at the time, but everyone forgets it. This is why you can't trust like collective history, which is basically like the mob just remembering something. They always forget the key details. So I've always said this. You'll have seen this when you've seen me on talk shows. One of the best methods I have for finding out that people at least have done something sketchy is, unlike everyone else, when they tell me their alibi, I say, all right, okay, we'll take your alibi, we'll take the premise, and we'll follow it to the logical conclusion. Well, this was Flusha's alibi, and everyone forgets this because he did the clever move, by the way, a move I've implied many times. When you have a meme that's damaging you, you take control of it. You say, right, I'm going to take that meme and I'm going to have fun with it. So in his case, he did loads of jokes over the years. Like he had a t-shirt that said he was like a lifter or some shit. Like he basically kind of like controlled the meme to take all the sting away from it. Because then people's logic was, well, if he joked about it, he never would have done it. I'd just say I'd look into the case of a guy called Jimmy Savile if you want to believe that people wouldn't joke about evil shit that they're actually doing, because you might find out some scary shit there. But the point I was going to make was this. His alibi went like this. I have a really weird style and setup with my mouse. And what I do, think about people who have those huge mouse pads, but they put it right next to the keyboard. The logic was he was one of those guys who only uses like the leftmost part of his keyboard. I'm assuming he's right-handed. And that, sometimes when I have to do a really big 180, my hand hits the keyboard. And when it hits the keyboard, that's what happened with that moment. That's why it looked like it aim locked. Well, here's the problem with that Flusha and Fnatic organization and all of your supporters. It should have continued to happen for the rest of your career in all your demos. Logically, that's the only thing that makes sense. Unless you did some crazy change of your setup and you did all that, which I've never ever heard that he has, it should have continued on. In fact, I even made this point to like Khan, because he's a mate of mine in Fnatic, and they didn't seem to get my point though. I said, the worst thing that could ever happen for you is if he almost never does this again, mate, because since you've set that up as a reasonable alibi, it has to be able to happen more. And all I'll tell you is this. If there was like 50 of those clips before everyone started witch hunting him, maybe he did it 2 times ever in like the 5 years after the fact. So I'm not saying that there's a strong conclusion can be drawn from that, but fucking hell, doesn't look good if that was your alibi. I think you might have fucked that one up, guys.
As we come to the end of the interview, I wanted to ask if you had any sort of final thoughts or anecdotes or just anything that you wanted us to mull over as we sort of digest the whole piece.
I would just say the most important note to take away is what I said when I was talking about how, as a journalist, you try to figure out what are your principles, because essentially your principles are sort of like the fucking northeast, west, south on a compass. They're supposed to be what guide you in the world. It's like, right, here's how I'm going to approach this situation when I'm confronted with it. And if you don't do that, I would just say, think of what I said before. If you end up not thinking through what your principle is on a certain topic, well, if you're dealing with someone you hate and you go too harsh, you're a piece of shit. If you're dealing with someone you like and you go too lean, you're a piece of shit. That is unfortunately the nature of the world. So it's worth just knowing, anytime an incident like this happens, just take the people out of the equation. Just think of what the abstract principle is and try and think, where do I come down on this? What should a punishment be? What is wrongdoing in this case? What should be the circumstances for if, for example, maybe you disagree. Maybe you think that you should get a reduced sentence if you come forward. Think it all through, then add in the individuals, particulars, the players that were involved in it, the coaches, and then run your little experiment and see what it spits out at the end. Essentially, that's the reason why we were all able to make fun of that CSPPA ranking. We didn't actually need to look at the methodology and stuff. We looked at the output and we were like, this output's garbage. So if the output's garbage, obviously it's a flawed system. So similarly, if you don't want to get caught out or you don't want to be someone who in the current media cycle, it happens all the time. You're just getting thrown from one side to another. Like, you're the guy where, I could never vote for a guy who's a rapist. Then your candidate's like accused of raping you, like, shit. But then you're going to vote for it. Like, in those scenarios, people are going to rightfully make fun of you, but it's because you haven't sort of like figured out where you stand. You need to figure out where you stand in the world before the winds of fucking happenstance just wash over you, basically.